We're resuming a conversation that we started a few months ago about New York schools diversity, but we're going to give you a little bit of a cheat sheet before we get into it. Our first slide now is going to talk about the statewide makeup. Now, in New York State, the proportion of Latino and Asian students has more than doubled from 1989 to 2010. So the face of our students is a lot different. But if we go a little bit further down, the typical white student in a public school attends school with about 30% of the class is low income. The inverse of that is Black and Latin students typically attend schools with closer to 70% of folks who are behind poverty. You see, we've advanced to New York City a little bit closer to home now, where in 2010, numbers showed that 19 out of 32 school districts had 10% or less of public school students who happened to be white. And more than half of the city school students are Black or Latino. More than half of those public schools had 90% attendance from Black and Latino kids, with 17% of magnets having less than 1%. So while the face of the state is changing, the city schools aren't really meeting that change in the classroom. Going forward, to look at our numbers for charter schools, 73% of those were labeled apartheid schools, which we'll get into just what that means in a second. But as you can guess, it's a high number of students of color, according to a report by the Civil Rights Project. And 6 out of 10 of the most diverse school districts in Brooklyn are broadly defined, meaning that there's about 20% white students, but less than 60% non-white students. So the complexion of our schools have changed, but not a lot has changed in terms of diversity in public schools. Back to Aaron.
Here to tell us just how diverse our public schools really are and how we can work towards and ensure greater diversity in the future, our City Council member Brad Lander from Brooklyn's District 39. Welcome back to BK Live.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Principal Sandra Beauvoir, Soto of PS 705, Brooklyn Arts and Science Elementary in Crown Heights. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And Max Freedman, a graduate researcher with the New Schools Center for New York City Affairs. And welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Councilman Landers, can you start off by telling us what is the School Diversity Accountability Act and why is it necessary?
Yeah. So first, thanks for having me on again to talk about this issue and really keeping the spotlight on it. It's just one of these issues that when we look at it, we know it's just an appalling shame that 60 years after Brown versus Board, we still have such segregated schools, but it somehow just seeps into our consciousness as something that's okay, and we stop looking at it. So I really appreciate your calling attention to it. And that's really the goal of the School Diversity Accountability Act. Because of mayoral control, the council does not have the power to direct a new admissions plan or process. But what we can do is say every year, the DOE has to give us full data on every school and really down to the classroom level. You know, one thing we can talk about a little more is you have some schools that might have a gifted and talented program and a gen ed program, and if like you watch the front door, maybe it looks diverse, but if you go into the classrooms, much less so. Yeah. So we're gonna get all that data, see it every year so we can see where the trends are going. Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? And also, what is DOE doing about it? And the good news is, for the first time this year, there's some small steps. They are nowhere near enough, but for the first time, there's a pilot of some elementary schools we'll talk about. There's some steps at middle and high schools, and the idea is, let's get all that out there. Let's get it out every year. Let's make sure the researchers have the information they need, but we can all see which way are we going and what steps do we need to take?
So Principal Beauvoir Soto, how does this fall on your list of priorities? Is it something that's at the front of your mind, or are you busy trying to keep the halls clean and the lights on? Like, where is it in terms of priorities?
All of the above, but it is definitely one of our top priorities at our school. Actually, a couple of years ago, a group of parents who really were interested in maintaining the diversity that our school enjoys got together with me and wrote a proposal to submit to the DOE to try to modify the enrollment policies a little bit to ensure that we could maintain the diversity that we have. It took a little while, but I'm really excited that we are one of the 7 pilot schools that was identified. And we've been given a 20% priority for English language learners and students who are in the child welfare system. So those students will take priority even over the zone children.
Okay. Now, before we move on to you, Max, can you tell me sort of how does the school zoning affect the residential segregation of New York City? Like how exactly will that play out if, there's such a stark contrast between neighborhood to neighborhood?
Yes, and as you alluded to, you can walk into my school and you do still see a degree of segregation. We opened 4 years ago in response to a school that closed in the same building. When that school closed, they were 90% Black and Latino. 95% of those students had some degree of poverty that entitled them to free and reduced lunch. My school opened 4 years ago, and that number came down from 95% to 80% free and reduced lunch. We are currently at 64% free and reduced lunch. So that speaks to the socioeconomic shifts that are reflected in the immediate zone. So as a result, if you walk through my school building, you'll see that my 3rd through 5th graders are still largely African American and Latino, and you see a bit more diversity in my early elementary grades.
The new wave. So then, Max, if we're looking at PS 705, that seems to be the exception to the rule, where there are people who are moving into a neighborhood and putting their time and resources and children into the school instead of choosing to educate them elsewhere.
Right. So that's what the report that I worked on that came out of the Center for NYC Affairs found, is that it's conventional wisdom has it that school segregation simply mirrors residential segregation,
right.
But in fact there are pockets of the city where the schools are more segregated than the zones that they are in. So for example, just very close to here, PS 287, in downtown Brooklyn, you have a school that is 89% Black and Latino in a zone that is 43% Black and Latino. You have a school that is, let's see if I remember the number, I think the median income of the school is $35,000 a year, and the median income of the zone is $77,000 a year. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge gap. Why is there that gap, right? That's the question. One way that happens is because people who move into that neighborhood may not have children. Mm-hmm. But the other way is that they may have children, and as you said, might choose to send them elsewhere. So we find this discrepancy most starkly, most often in District 3 on the Upper West Side, District 5 in Harlem, and District 13 right here, downtown Brooklyn, Brooklyn Heights, Fort Greene, and Clinton Hill. And the question is what to do about it.
But council member, you can take a chance on a neighborhood, but you're not likely to take a chance with your kids' education. How do you legislate away that fear?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to do is there's lots of things we can do to create more good options that are diverse. And we just haven't been focused enough on that. So look, part of the reason that what's taking place at Sandra's school is that it's clearly a good school and people want to go there. So there's no substitute for that. You got to work hard to make there be good schools, because no admissions criteria, we're not going to force kids to go to a school. We're going to create admissions criteria that sort kids among schools where they want to go in more inclusive and diverse ways. So you got to have schools people want to go to, and then use these admissions priorities to say, okay, and now we're going to make sure that that school has some balance based on English language learners, on free and reduced lunch, on kids in the child welfare system. And that model is working. I mean, part of what's exciting is these 7 schools that are in the pilot are schools people want to go to. And that's why they need these criteria. Again, that doesn't substitute to try to keep making sure
that every school
exactly. And look, at the rezoning issue here, right around this building, it's interesting. PS 307 is a school that is overwhelmingly kids of color, but which lots of people want to go to. And we'll see whether the Dumbo parents that are now zoned there go or don't go. But most people would tell you, if they went in and really looked objectively, that's a school I'd send my kids. 287 has had a harder time getting to the point where a lot of people would say that. So we've got to do both things. We've got to keep help getting all schools better, and it really is step by step. It's harder to do that in schools that are overwhelmingly kids who are low income. I mean, just all the data shows it takes more resources. It's harder when you've got kids who are in trauma, who are just dealing with the challenges of being in places of concentrated poverty. Okay. And of course, easier when you've got kids with some more resources. So, we're not going to get there by trying to do a mandatory forced busing program that. But we certainly can take steps forward. And some of this, it can't all be school by school. Some of this does have to be done at the district level. So districts 1 and 13 and 3 are exploring models that achieve more of a balance throughout the district.
Now, you're talking about the different models, but is there any sort of preferred model based on certain neighborhoods, or how do you gain consensus on the different models?
Well, it's a great question, and we're just at the beginning, sadly. I mean, we should be a lot farther along, but I think the pilot that these elementary schools are using is good, and we'll see it work, and we'll want to do a lot more of it. I think we've got to try one of these district-wide models that districts 1 and 13 especially, their CECs, the Community Education Councils, have voted to try this model called controlled choice, which is a terrible name, but a good policy. I know, I really want them to come up with like balanced choice. Yeah. It basically says the elementary schools on District 1 on the Lower East Side are already non-zoned. And the middle schools in District 13 and District 15 are already non-zoned. They're choice systems where you apply and you rank choices. And these systems that balance diversity district-wide just balance those rankings with the kinds of criteria that we're talking about. So it just spreads people's choice.
Is there going to be flexibility in the criteria from the principal's sort of perspective?
I believe there will be, because it's not a strict set-aside. It's set up as a priority. If I don't fill those 20%, does that mean those seats stay empty? Obviously, we're gonna fill those seats. So I think it's going to allow us some time to get up to the numbers that we'd like to see and to support the diversity that we are enjoying currently at the school. I would say that even outside of the pilot, though, I would encourage young families who are looking for schools to check out the school that's right in their backyard. There are a lot more good schools out there than maybe on the map. I think the only reason my school is one of those schools that people want to come to is because a few parents who moved into the neighborhood said, we think there's some potential here, we'd like to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And they stuck through. And here we are 4 years later. Yes, a few parents came and moved on. But a good number have stayed and made it the place that it is. That parent involvement piece is really, really important.
Can we talk about those parents who have moved on? Because we're really happy that you're part of the pilot and you've got those young people in starting fresh. But are we going to have like a lost generation who didn't get to start kindergarten with diverse classes and economic and social mixes that enhance everyone? What of those kids who sort of missed the boat on that? How do we correct them before they start trying to go to a selective high school here and get largely shut out by the numbers that we see? What happens to those kids who aren't kindergartners?
That's actually one of the reasons that I opened the school 4 years ago. I based the model largely on what I experienced with my own children that all went through New York City public schools, and children of color that I've had to advocate for in different ways. But they've all managed to get through to really great competitive high schools, and I think it's simply because of the exposure that they receive growing up. And I think we're conscious of the fact that people who don't have the resources readily available to them may never have access to that social, I guess, I don't know what you want to call it, the social and cultural.
That thing that But then, Max, are you guys any closer to sort of defining what that thing is? Like, what is it about sitting in a class that's diverse income and ethnically diverse that enhances students? And we talked about this before. It can be that sitting next to a white guy makes you any smarter.
Right. That's a really good question and a really hard question, because I think that idea that you just said, that the sort of like magic spillover effect of white kids, is something that is can be implicit in this conversation if we're not careful about it, and that's a real turnoff for good reason to communities of color. I think the arguments that are advanced for why this is important is that I mean, the barriers to the kind of work that parents have to do in order to push their schools to be the kinds of schools that they want them to be are structural, right? I mean, we're talking about poverty and the structural forces that create and sustain poverty. And so when you want to talk about having a more integrated school, then you have parents who are middle income, higher income, have more time, have more resources, speak the language of the bureaucracy to be able to push for those changes in the school. However, we can have that conversation, but I personally think we need to continue to have the conversation about how we can empower those parents who still don't have access to those social networks, social capital, financial capital to do the kind of fundraising.
That being said, can I just jump in for 1 second?
Yeah.
Because in the course of this, our producer, Ro Johnson, sent an exhaustive list of things for us to read, and one of them was the DO report on diversity,
Yeah.
and it made my eyes bleed. Like, I do not at all pretend that I'm at all versed in reading these reports, but I could imagine how intimidating it would be to have a student that's going to school every day and not be able to make heads or tails of that report. And I think I'm kind of smart, but reading the thing, it was impossible almost. Who in your office reads these and digests it for you?
A couple of things, and this is an interesting kind of public policy wonk debate.
Yeah.
For the most part right now, the state of the art is getting the government to release the data so researchers can crunch it and help us see what it says. We tried the version of let's have them write a report that looks good, but then they massage it and don't give you all the data and tell you the happy story they want to tell you. So we've switched to a more data dump model, and then it takes a little. That only came out right at the end of the year, so it was only a month ago. And I think there's some researchers, and actually WNYC did something quickly right away, looking at the composition of kids in gifted and talented programs, which they had long suspected but hadn't had the data on. And there's going to be more that'll come out of the sort of data dump version of the report. I was a little disappointed. As I said, the law not only requires the data, it requires the things DOE is doing, and they're doing a lot of things. They put them all in a spreadsheet that was a little like, they could have said, here's what we're trying to, so it could have been a little more uplifting. Nothing would prevent them from doing that. I want to respond on one thing that on this question of the research, because it was a great New York Times op-ed a few months back called "Diversity Makes You Brighter," and they did that was a randomized scientific study. Now, it was for team problem solving. They essentially posed team problem solving challenges, and what they found were that diverse groups did better at solving those problems. Now, that's not everything. That's not how you learn to do algebra, how you learn to read. There are things we do to better together in diverse groups, and a lot of those things we want in our society, in our government, in our businesses, and we're not going to get them there if we don't have them in our schools. So it is true that concentrated poverty is a barrier to school success, and we should all own that. It's also true that the diverse society and problem solving we want, we all benefit from having, and we all suffer from not having.
And these are long-term goals. Yeah, exactly. Before we end the conversation, can you just sort of define to us one more moment what an apartheid school is and what exactly is being done to address the most egregious problems in these schools?
No. So it's not an official government term. I mean, it is what it sounds like. It's schools that are overwhelmingly African American and Latino, and in some cases people look at poverty as well, overwhelmingly low income. And the goal is to look at how many of those we have and what we're doing about it. And again, there are schools that are overwhelmingly low-income kids of color that do very successful. So this is not an argument that you can't have that you can't make a school that enables kids to succeed. But everybody knows that it's a lot bigger barrier. And it's unfair to those kids to expect that they're going to, so the goal is to, even though it's uncomfortable, to force ourselves to look at it, to see the data, and to try to keep pushing us every year to make it better.
Well, thank you all for joining us to have the hard conversation with some skill. Thank you. We appreciate it.